My name is Eileen Bledsoe. I'm 68 years old. And on the second Sunday in October, my daughter-in-law stood at my kitchen sink with my own dish towel over her shoulder and told 9 people that I'd been giving my husband's things away and forgetting I ever did. She said it kindly. I need you to hear that part first, because if you're waiting for somebody to hiss it, you'll be waiting all night and you'll miss the whole thing. She had a manila folder open on my table, and she went down it the way you'd read off a grocery list, the burner I left on in June, the box that supposedly went to the church rummage, my husband's wedding ring, which she says I handed her at the funeral home to keep safe, and which I have never in my life handed to anybody. Then she looked at my son and said the sentence she'd been saying to me for 16 months. I've been taking it off her hands, Jared. Somebody had to. And my son, who's 36 years old and has his father's shoulders and did not that afternoon have 1 inch of his father's spine, looked down at his plate. Nobody in that kitchen knew about the envelope in my apron pocket. It had come certified on Thursday, and I'd signed for it standing at the end of my own lane, and it had my husband's name on the front of it, Randall Bledsoe. He'd been dead 19 months that week. I'm going to go back and tell it in order, because if I start at the envelope, you'll think I'm a clever old woman, and I wasn't clever. I was slow. I was slow the way you're slow about the people you'd trust with your house key. And by the time I got fast, 61 pieces of my husband's life had already been sold to strangers, and everything she couldn't sell was sitting in a rented metal building 26 miles from my sink, 9 days from being auctioned off to whoever showed up with cash. Welcome back to Porch Stories, where the grandmother a family agreed to worry about turns out to be the only one who was counting. If your own people have ever started talking about you in the third person while you were standing right there in the room, stay with me tonight. Leave a comment and tell me how long that went on in your house before somebody finally said it to your face. And subscribe, because I need somebody outside this county to know what a mailbox at the end of a lane is actually worth. I'll start in the March before last. I gave 31 years to the post office. Route 4, out of the Vincennes office, up through the north end of Knox County, and back down along the river bottoms. 400 and some boxes. I could tell you which ones had the flag that stuck, and which ones had a dog, and which ones had a woman who came out on the porch every single day at 11:15 because I was the only person she'd talk to before supper. 31 years of putting things in boxes and pulling things out of boxes, and I retired 4 years ago with a cake in the break room and a jacket I've never worn. I'm telling you that because it's the shape of my head. I count. I don't know how else to say it. I count without deciding to. I counted the pieces in my satchel in the morning, and I counted the ones left at the end, and I never once in 31 years came back to the office with a piece I couldn't say where it went. If you put me in a room, I'll tell you how many chairs are in it. It's not a virtue, it's a habit, and it has made me tiresome at family dinners for 4 decades. Randall was a railroad man, 38 years, section hand first and then signal maintainer on the branch that used to run from town up to Bruceville. He kept the relays and the crossings and the little metal boxes that nobody thinks about until the gates come down wrong. He had a saying he used on me for 45 years, mostly when I was fretting about something I could have just gone and checked. You don't guess a signal, Eileen. You go and look. That's the whole man. He would not guess. He would drive 9 miles in the sleet at midnight to put his hand on a thing rather than sit at the table wondering about it. And he was late to every wedding we ever attended, and I loved him for it, and told him so approximately never. He died in the barn on a Tuesday morning, the 9th of March. He was 70. He'd gone out to put up the last shelf on the east wall, and he got 3 of the 4 brackets in, and he was reaching for the 4th one, and that was it. Clyde Baumgardner found him at 11, and he called me before he called anybody else, and I want to tell you what he said, because it's the last kind thing anybody said to me for a year and a half. He said, "Eileen, don't drive yourself. I'm coming to get you." Clyde is 74. He was Randall's partner on the line for 22 years, and he has one thumb that doesn't bend, from a splice that went wrong in 1991. He never comes to the door. He parks by the pump house and stands at the corner of the porch until you notice him, like a man waiting on a train, and he'll stand there 10 minutes if he has to. He brings the brush hog blade back, sharpened whether or not you asked. He isn't a friend of mine exactly. He's a man who owes my husband a shift from 1991 and has never gotten square with him, and he's been paying it to me since March, and both of us know it and neither of us has ever said it. Now, the shelves. For 38 years, my husband brought home glass, insulators, the fat little ones off the crossarms of the old telegraph line that ran beside the track. When they pulled those poles down in the 80s, half of them went to the scrap men and half of them went into the trunks of railroad men's cars, and Randall came home with a coffee can of them the first spring and never stopped. Aqua and clear and one that was the green of a pop bottle and 3 that were true cobalt, which he kept up higher than the rest without ever explaining why. Some of them still had the wire scars on the tie wire groove. Some of them had a bubble in the glass the size of a pea, and he'd hold one up to the kitchen window on a Sunday and tell me about the man who blew it in Elmer, Indiana, in 1911. And I'd say, uh-huh. And he'd say, Eileen, look at it. And I'd look. And it was pretty. It was genuinely pretty. Blue light on the sink. By the end, there were somewhere over 400 pieces on those barn shelves. Most of them were worth $8 or $10 to anybody in the world. 40 of them were worth real money. I did not know which 40. I want to be honest about that. I never once asked, because asking felt like appraising him, and because it was his. 3 of them lived on my kitchen windowsill over the sink. Aqua, and the pop bottle green. That's where they'd been since 1987. That's my small good life. And here's the rest of it. Copper is a red heeler, 13 years old, mostly deaf, and he is the only one on this place who still keeps Randall's hours. Every afternoon at 4:40, he walks down to the end of the lane and sits where the gravel meets the road, because that is when the truck used to come. And he waits about 20 minutes, and then he comes back up and lies down under the porch step. He has done that for 19 months. There is nothing to be done about it. I've quit trying. Kinley is 9. She's my son's girl. And she has a fact for you the second she gets out of the car. She starts every one of them the same way. Did you know a heron can swallow a fish sideways? Did you know your fingernails grow faster on the hand you write with? She keeps them somewhere and brings them out, one at a time, like a woman pulling eggs. Out of an apron. She sorted the glass on my windowsill by color when she was 6 and decided the aqua ones were girls and the clear one was a boy, and she was extremely stern about it. And when her grandfather told her that wasn't how glass worked, she looked at him with the flattest pity I've ever seen on a child and said, "It is at Grandma's. Rosemary is my older sister, 72, out on the Bicknell Road. She calls at 8 in the morning, and she does not say hello. She just starts. 40 years of that. I could tell you what she had for supper last Thursday. Jared is my son. He's a diesel mechanic at the county highway garage, and he's good at it. He came out of me quiet, and he stayed quiet. And I used to think that was peaceable, and I have had to sit down this year with the idea that it was never peace at all. It was a boy who figured out early that the fastest way through a room is to agree with whoever's talking loudest and go work on something in the garage. That's not a crime. It just isn't enough. And there came a Sunday when it wasn't enough by a mile. And Kelsey, my daughter-in-law, 34 years old, quick, funny, capable in a way I openly admired for 11 years. She runs a booth at the flea market out at the fairgrounds most Saturdays, and she is good at it. She can look at a box of somebody's dead aunt's kitchen and tell you inside of a minute what's worth carrying to the truck. I used to say that about her proudly. I said it to Randall. I said, "That girl has an eye." She does. She has a wonderful eye. I want that in the record too, because if I paint her as a fool, none of the rest of this makes sense. Randall was buried on the 14th. That June, Kelsey started coming out on Wednesdays. She came with a casserole the first time, and she stayed 3 hours, and she washed my kitchen floor without asking, on her knees, in good jeans. I sat at the table and cried a little, and let her. The second time, she brought Kinley and a bucket, and they did the porch rails. The third time it was raining, and she went down and got the mail on her way up the lane, and she came in with it in her arms and set it on the counter and said the sentence, "Let me take that off your hands." She said it about the mail. She said it about the propane bill and the tax notice and Randall's pension paperwork and the box of sympathy cards I could not open. She said it every single Wednesday for 16 months, and about 11 other things besides, and I want you to sit with how it sounded, because it sounded like the kindest thing anybody said to me that whole year. It sounded like a hand under my elbow. By August, she was getting the mail every visit. By October, she was getting it twice a week, because she was out that way anyway. By Christmas, she had a habit of stopping at the box on her way in, and I had a habit of not walking down there, and I want to tell you exactly how bad that is, and I'm going to make myself say it plain. For 11 years, I gave a talk at the senior center twice a year, 15 minutes with a folding chair and a coffee. And the first thing I said, every time, the thing I opened with, was, "Don't let anybody bring your mail up for you. Not a neighbor, not a nephew, not the nice young man from the church. Walk down and get it yourself, and if you can't walk down there anymore, that's a different conversation, and it starts with a locking box." I gave that talk for 11 years. Then it rained one Wednesday in June, and she was already parked, and I let it happen every day for 16 months. That's the shame, and it's mine, and I've quit trying to set it down. The ring went in January. Randall's wedding band lived in a jelly jar on the windowsill next to the glass. It had lived there since about 1994 because his hands swelled at the end of a shift, and he'd pull it off in the truck, and it would ride in the ashtray for a week. And I finally put a jelly jar on the sill and told him that was its house. After he died, I put it back in the jar. That's where it was. That's where it always was. One Wednesday in January, I was making coffee, and my eye went to the sill the way it does, and the jar was there and the ring was not. I didn't say anything for 2 days. I looked in the sink trap. I took the drawer out. I went through the pockets of the coat I'd worn to the funeral home, twice. And then on Friday, I called Kelsey, and I made my voice light because I was already afraid of how it would sound. And she answered on the first ring, and she was so warm, and she said, "Oh, Eileen, I moved it. It was sitting right by the drain in an open jar, one splash, and it's gone down the pipe forever. I put it somewhere safe." And I said, "Well, where's somewhere safe?" And she laughed and said she'd bring it Wednesday, and Wednesday she brought a pot roast and Kinley and a story about the school bus, and no ring. And when I asked her at the door, she put her hand flat on my arm and said, "I will absolutely bring it. Write it on your calendar so I don't forget. Write it on your calendar." 6 words. She was building something, and I heard it as help. I want to walk you through the year the way I lived it, which is not the way it reads now. Now, it reads like a straight line. Then it was one small wrong thing every 5 or 6 weeks, with a perfectly good explanation attached to it, and 40 good things in between. February. I went out to the barn to look for the little propane heater, and I stood in front of the east wall, and something was off about the shelves, and I could not tell you what. The glass was there. The rows looked full. I stood there maybe 2 minutes with the light on, and then the cold got into me, and I went back inside and made soup. Here's what I'd seen, and hadn't understood yet. The front row had been pushed forward. Every shelf, faced up neat to the front edge, the way a woman who works a flea market booth faces a table so the box reads full from the aisle. Behind the front row there was air. I didn't see it in February. I saw it in July with a flashlight, and I'll get there. March, the anniversary. Jared came out alone and we drove to the cemetery, and he stood there with both hands shoved down in his coat and didn't say anything for 11 minutes, and then said he'd hate that stone. "It's too shiny." And he was right, and we both laughed, and that was the best hour I've had with my son since his father died. And I want that in here too, because I'm not going to pretend the boy is nothing to me. April. Kinley on the counter with her feet swinging, sorting the sill glass, and she picked up the pop bottle green one and turned it over and said, "Did you know the ones with chips aren't worth as much?" I said. "Is that so?" She said. "Mom says. She says a chip on the bottom is okay, but a chip on the top part is bad." I said, huh, and I put the kettle on, and I stood at the stove, with my back to a 9-year-old, and felt something go cold in the middle of me. Because there is no reason on this earth for a child to know the difference between a base chip and a dome chip on a piece of railroad glass. That is not a thing you pick up. That is a thing you hear said, over and over, by somebody sorting. That's the crack in the wall. And here's the true part. I did not go out to the barn that night. I went to bed. I lay there and I built her an explanation, and it was a good one. Kelsey works a booth. Kelsey looks things up. Maybe she'd looked up what Randall's glass was worth because she was being helpful. Because someday I'd want to know for the insurance. And she'd told her daughter about it at supper the way you do. I built that. Nobody built it for me. Give a woman 1 year of grief and no sleep, and she'll do the defense work herself for free. May is when the word arrived. Jared was in the driveway with the hood up on my car, and I asked him, light, standing there with my arms folded, whether Kelsey had ever gotten around to the ring, because it had been 4 months, and my son wiped his hands on the rag, and he did not look at me, and he said, Mom, Kelsey says you asked her about that twice in 1 week. I said I might have. I said, so where is it? And he said, nobody's saying anything about you. It's just you've been having a hard year and you're out here by yourself, and stuff slips. Slips. I want you to understand what that word does when you're 68 and you live alone and your husband is in the ground. It doesn't land like an insult. It lands like a diagnosis. Because after that word gets said out loud once in a family, it isn't a thing you can argue with, it's a lens. And every single thing you do afterward goes through it. I ask where the ring is. That's the slipping. I say the shelves look funny. That's the slipping. I get quiet at Sunday dinner. That's the slipping. And isn't it sad? And shouldn't somebody look into it? And the thing about that word is, I couldn't be sure. That's the part I didn't expect. I'd stand in the barn and I'd think, well, how would I know? How would a woman who was going to be wrong about this be able to tell she was wrong about it? So I'd walk back to the house without checking, and that is the entire purpose of the word. I'm going to stop here a second. Some of you got there 2 steps ahead of me, and it's costing you something. If you have ever had a family decide a thing about you, and then start reading everything you do through it the way a hard year turns into a diagnosis, and the diagnosis turns into a reason nobody has to answer your question, leave a comment and say so. I'd genuinely like to know whether it went faster for you than it went for me. And if you're new here, subscribe, because the thing that finally settled it came to the end of my lane in a plastic window envelope, and I had to stand in the gravel and sign for it. June. The burn barrel. I burn the junk mail. Always have. You'd be amazed what comes to a rural box. And I was tipping the wastebasket into the barrel, and a slip of paper caught the wind and went across my shoe, and I picked it up because I'm 68, not dead. Post office receipt, not from my box from the counter downtown, $18.40. Insured, $600. To a town in Oregon I'd never heard of. I stood by a burning barrel with that receipt in my hand for a long time. $600 of insurance means a person told the clerk what the contents were worth. That's not a guess. That's a number somebody had in their head walking in the door. I put it in my apron pocket and I brought it inside and I put it in the drawer under the phone book. And that drawer is where this whole thing started to have a bottom to it. July. And I finally did what Randall told me to do for 45 years. I took a flashlight out to the barn at 9 o'clock at night, and I did not stand there wondering. I went and looked. The front row was faced. Behind it, nothing. On the second shelf from the top, where the 3 cobalt ones had always sat off by themselves, there were 2 clear ones standing in their dust rings, and the dust rings were the wrong size. That's the detail I can't get out of my head. 19 months of dust makes a ring, and if you set a smaller piece down in a bigger ring, the ring is still there around it, like a chalk line at a wreck. I counted. Of course I counted. I got the step stool, and I did every shelf, and I wrote it on the back of an old route sheet from the drawer, because that's the paper I reach for, and I have 400 of them, and I'll never use them for anything else. 231 pieces. I sat on an upturned bucket in my husband's barn, and I remembered a coffee can that turned into a shelf that turned into a wall, and I could not tell you the true number that should have been there. 400, I'd have said. 400 and something. Here is the part where I nearly lost, and I'm going to tell it, because if I leave it out, I'm no use to you. A week later, I counted again. 245. 14 more than the week before. Nobody had brought me 14 pieces of glass. Nobody had said a word. And I sat down on that bucket in the dark, and for about an hour, I believed them. Not halfway. All the way, I thought. All right, Eileen. There it is. You've counted your whole life, and now you can't count. And every miserable thing you've built in your head about that girl is a symptom. And you are going to have to be very brave about this, and go to the doctor. I went in the house, and I sat at the kitchen table until 2:15 in the morning. And I did not cry about Randall, which is what I usually did at that hour. I cried about my own head. And then, somewhere around 2:30, 31 years of route sheets came up out of the floor and said, "A count that changes isn't a bad count. A count that changes is a shelf that's moving." The next morning, I photographed every shelf with my telephone, with the date on it, and I did it again every Sunday night after that. Third Sunday, 245. Fourth Sunday, 245. Fifth Sunday, 223. 22 pieces gone in 7 days, out of a barn on a farm where the only vehicles that come up the lane are mine, my son's, Clyde's truck on a Saturday, and a white Equinox every Wednesday. She'd put 14 back after I asked about the ring. She'd gotten spooked, and she'd walked some of it back onto the shelf, and then she'd waited 2 weeks and taken nearly twice that. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be very clear about that, because people expect triumph here. I sat on my own back step and I felt sick, and Copper came out from under it and put his chin on my foot, and down at the end of the lane it was 4:40, and neither one of us went down there. August. Clyde, at the corner of the porch. He'd brought the blade back, and he was standing out there in the heat with his hat in his hand doing his 10 minutes, and I brought him a glass of tea, and we talked about the beans, and then he cleared his throat in the particular way a man does when he has been carrying something up a lane. "Eileen," he said, "I want to say I hope you didn't take it wrong that I bought the one back." I said, "Bought what back?" And Clyde Baumgardner looked at me, and I watched a 74-year-old man go gray under his sunburn. "The Hemingway," he said. "Off the auction. The 42 in the Aqua, the one Randall got off the pole at Freelandville. I paid $80 for it. I figured if you had to sell it, I'd rather it be me holding it than some fella in Ohio, and I wasn't ever going to say a word about it, and I'm saying it now because your face is wrong. Clyde collects. He and Randall traded for 30 years. He is on the boards and in the newsletters, and he goes to the shows in Terre Haute, and he had been watching a seller out of Knox County put my husband's glass up for sale, piece by piece, since May. He thought it was me. That's what I want you to sit with. He thought it was me. A widow selling off her husband's collection is the most ordinary sad thing in the world. So he never asked me, because asking would have embarrassed me, and instead he quietly bought one back at $80 so I'd get a fair price from a friend. Every man on those boards thought it was me. There is a whole county of decent people who spent 5 months being tactful about a thing that was not happening. Clyde got out his telephone and he sat down on my porch step, which he has never done, and he showed me the seller's page. The photographs were taken on my kitchen counter. I want to tell you how I knew, because it wasn't a guess. It was the towel. There's a dish towel with a rooster on it that my mother gave me in 1979, and it has a scorch on one corner from a Thanksgiving I'd rather not discuss. And it's folded under every single one of those pieces of glass as a photo backdrop in 90-some pictures, with the scorch showing in about a third of them. Behind the glass in 11 of the photographs, you can see 6 inches of my window frame and the corner of the sill and the Aqua one that's still sitting there. She'd done it at my counter, in the light I liked. While I was at the eye doctor in Washington on Wednesday mornings, an hour each way, An appointment she drove me to 11 times this year and waited for, very kindly, in the parking lot. 61 lots. Sold, closed, shipped, feedback left, starting the 9th of May. I got out a pencil and the back of another route sheet, and I sat at that table and added them up in columns while Clyde held the phone steady for me. And it took us the better part of 2 hours, because I made him go back so I could check the ones I'd already put down. $4,182. One piece, the cobalt one, with the odd embossing that Randall kept up high and never explained, went for $1,275 to a man in Oregon named Ralph Hollingshead. That's the $18.40 in the burn barrel. That's the $600 in declared insurance, and she'd under-declared it by half, which tells you she was being careful about the postage. $4,182. And the thing that finished me wasn't the number. It was the seller feedback. 91 buyers, all of them delighted. Beautiful piece, packed like a museum. Thank you so much, my grandfather worked the moan on. 91 strangers, thanking her. She was good at it. She was so good at it. Now, September was the low month, and I'll be quick about it, because nothing in September worked. I tried to talk to my son. I did it right. I asked him to come out on a Saturday without Kelsey, and I made his father's chili, and I did not raise my voice, and I laid it out in order. The ring in January, the receipt in June, the count in July, the photographs in August. I had the route sheets. I had the dates on my telephone. I even had Clyde's $80. And Jared sat there and he got quieter and quieter. And when I finished, he looked at the table and he said, "Mom, do you hear how much you've been keeping track of?" That's the sentence. That's what it costs. I brought a chart to a man who'd already been told the woman holding it was slipping, and every single item on it made me look worse, because the frame was already up and I was standing inside it holding evidence like a crazy woman with a shoebox. He said Kelsey had been telling him for months that she was worried. He said she'd told him I called her about the ring 4 times in 1 week, which I did not do. And I know I did not do it. And I could not prove I did not do it. And that's a special kind of quicksand. He said the glass was probably in a box somewhere. And had I looked in the crawl space, then he said, and I don't think he heard himself, "Nobody's after Dad's stuff, Mom. It's junk glass off a fence row," which is exactly what a person says when they've been told what it's worth and are working very hard not to have been told. I did not fight with him. I put the chili away and I walked him out, and at the truck he hugged me the way you hug a woman you've decided about, with a pat at the end, and he said, "Wednesday? Okay? Kelsey'll bring Kinley." And then he said the last thing, gently, in the dark, and it was the real reason the whole year had been built. "And we should probably talk sometime about whether you want to keep doing all this out here by yourself." That's the true bottom of it. That's what all of it was for. The glass was cash, the house was the plan. There's an apartment complex by the hospital, 1 level, no lane to walk. Kelsey had mentioned it 3 separate times since spring, always to somebody else, always in front of me. I lay awake that night doing the arithmetic that people my age do. Fight her, and you're the difficult grandmother. Difficult grandmothers see their granddaughters at Christmas, in a restaurant, for an hour and a half. That's the whole price list, and both of us knew it, and she'd been reading it to me all year in a kind voice. I went to bed the 3rd week of September having decided, more or less, that the glass was gone and the money was gone, and there was nothing left to go and look at. I was wrong about that, and the 9th of October is when I found out. Lucinda Mattingly has Route 4 now. She's good. She leaves the flag up wrong, and it drives me insane, and I've never said a word to her about it. She didn't leave a slip in the box. She drove up my lane, which you're not obligated to do, and she got out with the scanner in her hand and stood there in the gravel, while Copper barked at nothing, and she said, "Eileen, I've got a certified for Randall." I said, "Randall's been gone 19 months, Lucinda." And she said, "I know it, hun. I'm going to have you sign for it." I signed my own name on the line for my dead husband's mail on the 12th of a month, in my slippers, and Lucinda Mattingly did not say one single word about it, not a raised eyebrow, Not a joke. Nothing. Because she's a carrier, and it's not her business what's inside. And I have never been more grateful to a professional in my life. It came on the 9th of October. Randall died on the 9th of March. I noticed that standing at the mailbox, and then I made myself quit noticing things like that, because a woman who's been told she's slipping cannot afford to find meaning in a calendar. I want to tell you what 31 years does. I knew what it was from the weight and the window and the green card before I opened it. Certified mail is bad news with a receipt. In 31 years, I handed a few hundred of those to people at their doors, and I watched their faces while they signed. And not one time, not one, was it good news. Not once. Nobody ever handed me one. I opened it standing up in my kitchen. Notice of public sale. Lien enforcement. Bickle Road self-storage. Out the state road toward Bicknell. Unit B14. Leased in the name of Randall Bledsoe. Past due since the 11th of August. Balance owed, with the late fees and the lien fee, $412. And then the paragraph the law makes them print, in the same size type as everything else. The contents of said unit will be sold at public auction on the 22nd of October at 10 o'clock in the morning. Sale is open to the public. And under that, the part that made me put my hand on the counter, because the statute requires them to describe what's in there in general terms, so nobody can say later they didn't know. General description of property, household goods, cardboard boxes and totes, one leather coat, hand tools, one folded flag in a wooden case, one leather coat. I want to be very plain about how this letter reached me, because it's the only reason any of this ever came out, and it's the whole reason I'm sitting here talking to you tonight, instead of sitting in an apartment by the hospital wondering what happened to my life. Ordinary mail can be lifted out of a rural box by anybody who gets there first, and it had been, every day, for 16 months. But this one had to be signed for. The law makes them send that notice to the name and the address on the lease, and the name on the lease was Randall Bledsoe, and the address on the lease was my kitchen. She'd used his name and my house, and the law walked it up my lane and put it in my hand. I did not call anybody. I got in the car Friday morning and I drove 26 miles, because you don't guess a signal. Bickle Road self-storage is 14 rows of orange doors and a gravel lot and an office with a space heater. The young man behind the counter is Dustin Paget, 26 years old, and he had a textbook open next to the register, and when I put the notice on the counter, he read the whole thing before he said one word, which I respected. Then he said, "You're not Randall Bledsoe." I said, "No, honey, he's my husband. He's been dead since March a year ago." Dustin Paget looked at the notice, and then at his screen, and then at his hands. He was very careful with me. He pulled the lease up, and he turned the monitor a little, not toward me, just a little, which I think was as far as he felt he could go. And he said the account was opened on the 21st of June last year, online and signed electronically, which means typed, a name typed into a box, from an email address, with a card number. I asked what the email address was. He said he couldn't tell me that, and he was right not to. But then he did the one honest thing that was actually his to do, and he did it well, and I've thought about it 100 times since. He said, "Ma'am, I'm going to tell you what I can and can't do, and I'm sorry about the second half. I can take $412 from anybody standing here with a card, and the sale comes off the list this afternoon. That part's easy. But I can't open that door for you. The door belongs to the name on the lease. Those are two different things. I paid the $412. It was on my debit card, and it came out of the propane money, and I have never spent anything so fast in my life. And then I stood in the gravel outside Unit B14 with my hand flat on an orange metal door, and I could not open it, because my husband's name was on it, and my husband was in the ground. There was a woman out there with a clipboard, 60-ish, ball cap, and she came over, Bridget Emmons. She runs the lien sales for 4 of these places between here and Washington. And she'd done the required walkthrough on B14 the week before they cut the tenant's lock. Inventory what's in there, and put their own lock on. So she was the one who'd written the description on my notice. She wrote, 1 leather coat. She wrote, 1 folded flag in a wooden case. She talked in that fast auction rhythm, even when she was being kind, which was disorienting. I've sold 400 of these units, she said. I've never sold a flag. I don't sell flags. If it comes to it, I'll pull it and set it in the office and you can come get it. And that's the only favor there is in me, so don't ask for another one. I said I wouldn't. Then I asked her what she'd seen. She thought about whether to tell me, and she decided, and I think what decided her was, that the notice is a public document and she'd written it herself. She said, boxes of photographs, and some of them are wet on the bottom, a man's coat on a nail, hand tools, a whole rack of them, decent ones, a wooden case with a flag folded in it, sitting on top of a milk crate, and about 160 pieces of glass in newspaper, in totes, and honey. Whoever packed those totes knew what they were doing. 160 pieces. That's the number that sent me back to the car to sit with both hands flat on the wheel. She hadn't sold it all. She'd sold the 61 that were worth carrying to the truck, and the rest of it, the $8 clears, the ones with the dome chips, the ones nobody wants, she'd boxed up and moved out of my barn and put in a rented room and stopped paying for. She didn't throw them out. Think about that for a second. She didn't take them to the dump. She wrapped them in newspaper, because that's what you do with glass, and she put them in a rented room, and then she let the rent lapse in August, and if that certified letter had gone in my box instead of my hand, on the 22nd of October, a man from Ohio would have bought my husband's coat and my wedding photographs and the flag off his casket for $150, sight unseen, and driven off with it, and I'd have never known where any of it went. Not ever. That's what the 22nd of October was going to be. I sat in that gravel lot, and I finally understood what I'd been looking at all year. I'd been thinking of it as stealing. It isn't quite. Stealing is a thing you do to a person. What she was doing was sorting the same thing she does at the fairgrounds every Saturday with a dead stranger's kitchen. This is worth carrying. This is not. There's no hate in it anywhere. That's what took me so long. I kept waiting to catch her hating me, and she never did, not for 1 minute. And it turns out, you don't have to hate a thing to price it. I'm going to pause once more, because I know what some of you are feeling right now. Some of you have a barn or a closet or a hall cupboard with somebody in it, and you just now thought about who has been kind to you about it lately. Comment and tell me what's in yours. I'll read them. And subscribe if you haven't, because what happened in my kitchen on the second Sunday in October is the reason I've told you any of this, and I'd like you to see it through with me. Now, Kelsey, and where she comes from, because I'm not going to hand you a woman with no history in her. Her mother is Retha Neese. When Kelsey was 11 years old, her daddy left in the spring, and by August there was a debt that had to be answered, and Retha's household got sold off the front lawn in one Saturday. Not an estate sale with a company and little stickers. The yard. Somebody's uncle with a folding table and a cash box. Kelsey sat on the porch steps the whole day because there was no place else to sit, and she watched a man she didn't know carry their kitchen table down the front walk, and I have heard her tell it twice in 11 years. Both times late, both times flat, as a road sign. At 11 years old, she learned the actual rule. A thing is worth whatever the fastest person in the yard says it's worth, and if you're not fast, you sit on the steps and watch. I've thought about that girl on those steps more this year than I've thought about almost anything. I've made room for her. I hope somebody made room for her then. And then I go out to my barn, and the shelves are faced forward like a booth at the fairgrounds, and I remember something that stops it cold. Nobody in that yard hid one thing from her. They sold it in the daylight with her sitting right there watching, and it was terrible, and it was honest. She did hers in my kitchen on Wednesdays while I was at the eye doctor, and then she went home and told my son I was forgetting. That's not the same wound. That's a lesson somebody taught her badly, and she took it and improved on it. Now the second Sunday in October. She called it, I want that understood before anything else. because it's the only thing in this story I feel any need to defend. I did not arrange that afternoon. Kelsey picked the day. Kelsey picked my kitchen. Kelsey called Rosemary and Jared, and Rosemary's boy, and his wife, and 2 of the cousins, and she picked what order they'd hear it in. She told them it was about whether I ought to keep living out there alone, and she asked them to come early, and she brought the folder. All I did was keep an envelope in my apron pocket and not tell her it was in there. I've turned that over a good deal. Whether a person who knows what's coming has to warn the one walking into it. And what I keep landing on is this. She wasn't walking into anything. She'd have had to walk into her own folder. I put a ham in at 11. I set the table for 9. I sent Kinley out to the porch with copper and the good markers before it started. And she said, "Did you know a dog can smell what you had for breakfast?" And I said I did know that, and I shut the door. It went the way she'd built it. Kelsey stood at my sink with my dish towel over her shoulder. She always did that. She always worked while she talked, and it makes a woman look so honest, and she was gentle the whole time. The burner in June, the rummage box, the ring, which she said I'd handed her at the funeral home and asked her twice a week about since. She said the word slipping once and then didn't need it again. Rosemary was nodding. Rosemary had been on the phone with her all summer, and then she looked at my son and said it. "I've been taking it off her hands, Jared. Somebody had to." 16 months of that sentence coming out of her one more time, in front of everybody, as the proof of her own goodness. I did not raise my voice. I want to tell you that, and it isn't pride I couldn't have. Whatever was in my chest was way past shouting. I got up, and I took the envelope out of my apron pocket, and I slid one page one, not the route sheets, not Clyde's telephone, not the pictures of the shelves into the middle of the table, face up, and I turned it so my son could read it right side up. I said, "Jared, read the bottom paragraph out loud." He didn't want to. He picked it up, and I watched my boy's face do the thing I've watched 100 faces do at 100 doors when they sign the green card and open it standing in the hall. He got to one leather coat and stopped. He tried it again and stopped again. Then he said, very quiet, not to me, not to her, to the table, "There's a flag in it." That coat hung on a nail in that barn for 38 years. Jared learned to drive in that coat because it was in the truck. The flag came off his father's casket, and I handed it to him myself at the graveside, and he handed it back to me on the way to the car because he was crying and couldn't hold it. And neither of us has ever mentioned that. And now it was a line item on a public sale notice with a date and a time on it. Kelsey went through it fast, and I'd never seen the whole sequence before. It took under 2 minutes. First, the tears, and they were real. She said she'd been drowning. She said nobody in this family had any idea what she carried, that she'd been out here every Wednesday for a year and a half, and not one person had ever once thanked her. Then the blame, and she swung it at my son before she swung it at me. Ask Jared where he thought the transmission money came from in July. Ask him. And my son said nothing, and his ears went red, and I learned something in that second that I've had to put away and look at slowly since. Then the authority. She stood up straight, and she got very calm, and she said, "I am the one who is here. I drive her to Washington. I do her mail. I clean this kitchen. You people show up on holidays, and you're going to sit at my table and hold up a piece of paper." And she stopped, because she'd said my table, in my kitchen, with my towel on her shoulder, and every single person in that room heard it. It was my sister who spoke, Rosemary, who had been nodding 20 minutes earlier, 72 years old, and she put her coffee down, and she didn't accuse anybody of anything. She just asked the only question that mattered, in the flattest voice I have ever heard out of her. "Kelsey, I've spent all summer telling half this county that my sister is losing her mind." She looked at her hands. "Who told me that?" Nobody answered her. Nobody had to. You could hear the refrigerator. I didn't have a speech. I'd had one in the car on the way back from Bicknell, and it was a good one, and it was gone. What I had was one thing to say, and I said it to Kelsey directly, in the ordinary voice I'd have used to ask her to pass the salt, because at some point in the last year I lost the ability to perform anything. I said, "You took it off my hands. That's the true part. Everything else in that folder is yours." And then I said the rest of it, and I kept it short, because I'd had 11 years of watching this woman work a table, and I finally understood you cannot out-talk her. You can only stop being a thing she's allowed to move. I said the unit was paid off Friday, and the sale was canceled, and she could stop worrying about the 22nd. I said I'd be at the courthouse Monday to get the paper that lets a widow open her own husband's door. I said Kinley is welcome in this house every day of her life for as long as I have one, and that has never once been in question, and it isn't now. And then I said the only thing I'd decided in advance, the thing I'd been turning over in the gravel lot with my hand on that door. You're not going to be alone in this house again. Not a punishment, not a request, just a thing that's true now. She said I couldn't do that. I told her I could. It's my lane. She took the folder. She left it open on the table by accident and had to come back for it. And that's the only clumsy thing I ever saw that woman do. Jared carried Kinley's markers out. He stopped at the door and he said, "Mom?" And I said, "Not today, honey." And he went. Clyde Baumgardner's truck came up the lane at 4:30 because it was Saturday's Blade and he'd gotten his days mixed up. And he stood at the corner of the porch with his hat in his hand while 9 cars went out past him. And he waited his 10 minutes, and then he came up and sat on the step with me until dark and asked me exactly nothing. After that, it went at the pace paper goes, which is to say slowly and then all at once. Monday, I went to the courthouse with the death certificate and filed the small estate affidavit, which anybody can do in this state once enough time has passed, and which I could have done 19 months ago if I'd been able to make myself do one single thing about his death. Wednesday, with the affidavit in my hand, Dustin Paget cut the facility lock off B14 and stood way back with his hands behind him and let me open it myself. And I have never been treated so decently by a stranger in my life. Randall's coat was on a nail. There was a nail in the drywall of a rented storage unit, which means somebody stood in there and hung it up on purpose. The flag was in its case, on a milk crate. Bridget Emmons never had to pull it. 4 totes of glass in newspaper. 158 pieces. His tools. 11 boxes of photographs, and the bottoms of 3 of them had gotten wet in the spring, and about 90 pictures are gone, including my mother's wedding, and there is nothing to be done about that either. I filed the report with the sheriff's department that Friday. It went to a county detective named Craig Rutledge, who was thorough and slow and asked me for things in a list, and I gave him the route sheets with the counts, the shelf photographs with the dates, the burn barrel receipt, the cellar page with 91 feedbacks, and my own rooster towel in the pictures, and the lease with a typed name on it and an email address that turned out to have been made in June of last year. It was the lease that did it. Everything else was a family arguing about property, and a prosecutor will tell you frankly that they do not want that. But a name typed into a signature box belonging to a man who'd been dead 3 months is a different animal. And there's a paragraph in the statute for it. Kelsey pled in February. Theft and 1 count for the lease. She got probation and a suspended sentence and an order to pay restitution $4,182 at $150 a month, which the clerk's office tells me is 2 years and 4 months if she doesn't miss. She'll miss. I'm not counting. Jared and Kelsey separated in November, before any of the court part. I did not ask him to do that, and I'd have told him not to if he'd asked me, and he didn't ask me. He came out in January and sat in his father's chair and told me the transmission thing, all of it, that in July she'd handed him $1,100 in an envelope and said it was from the booth, and that he had known better in the moment, for about 4 seconds, and had decided to be a man who did not know better. He cried, and he's 36, and I let him, and I did not tell him it was all right, because it wasn't, and he'd have known I was managing him. What he asked me at the door was, "How long did you know before you said anything?" I said, "Since April, more or less." And he said, "Why didn't you just tell me?" I said, "I did, honey, in September, with the chili." He stood there a while with that. Then he went out and started the truck and sat in the dark in my driveway for 11 minutes before he backed out, and I watched him from the window and let him have it. I didn't get the ring. That's the one I have to leave open. It went to a gold buyer at the motel out by the interstate in February of last year, weighed and paid at $140, and it was melted long before anybody wrote anything down. It's in something now, a chain, a filling, a wire in a machine somewhere. 45 years on a man's hand, and 11 months in a jelly jar, and $140, and there is no paragraph in any statute that gets that back. I got some of the glass, not much. Clyde put the word out on the boards, and it turns out those men are decent. 9 of them wrote back, and 6 of them mailed pieces to me at their own cost and wouldn't take a dime. Ralph Hollingshead in Oregon sent the cobalt one back in a box packed so carefully it took me 20 minutes to get into, with a note that said he'd have never bid if he'd known, and he hoped I'd let him know if I ever did want to sell it, which I thought was an honest thing to put in a note. One man in Missouri wrote back and said no, politely, and he was right. He paid a fair price to a seller who appeared to own the thing. The market never did one wrong thing here, only a person did. That was in April. It's June now. Here's what ordinary looks like, since ordinary is the entire prize. I walk down and get my own mail. Every day, 11:15, and Lucinda Mattingly still leaves the flag up wrong and I still say nothing. Kinley is out here Tuesdays and every other weekend, which is written down now on a schedule with her parents' names on it, and I've had to get used to the fact that my granddaughter's Tuesdays are a legal arrangement. She has decided that the ones with dome chips are hurt and get put in front where they can be seen. I don't correct her. Did you know a heron can swallow a fish sideways? I did know that. She's told me 4 times. 2 Saturdays ago, she and I finished the shelf. The 4th bracket had been sitting on the sill of the east window since the 9th of March a year ago, with the 4 screws and a jar lid next to it, exactly where he set them down. I held it, and she ran the drill because she wanted to, and she put the screws in crooked, and I left them crooked, and then we put the totes up on it, 158 pieces of railroad glass that nobody in the world wants, and 1 cobalt one from Oregon. 3 are back on the kitchen windowsill. Aqua, pop bottle green. In the morning, the light comes through and lands on the sink, which is where it's landed since 1987, and which is a thing I did not see for a year and a half because I did not look up. Copper still goes down at 4:40. He's 14 now. Some days I walk down with him and we both sit there a while, and I'll tell you the truth, I'm not entirely sure which one of us is waiting. Kelsey texted me in March, long, careful, apologized 4 separate times, and asked at the end if I would consider writing something for the judge. I read it twice standing at this counter, and I put my telephone face down and finished the beans, and I haven't answered it, and I haven't deleted it, and it's been 3 months, and I've stopped expecting that to change. Some doors don't need slamming. You just quit going over there to check they're shut. Here's what 19 months, $412, and 1 certified letter taught me, and it isn't about her. I used to think a man's things were the last of him, and that holding on to them was the same as holding on to him. Now I know the difference between the people who loved him and the people who didn't comes down to one question: which piece would he have kept? One of them can tell you in a second. The other one can only tell you what it went for. That's my story. 61 lots, 1 padlock that wasn't mine, and a certified letter with my dead husband's name on it that I signed for myself in the gravel. If somebody kind has been bringing your mail up from the box for you, a neighbor, a nephew, anybody at all, go down and get it yourself tomorrow, 1 time. That's the whole check, and it takes 4 minutes. Share this with the woman in your life who's been told she's slipping. Drop a comment and tell me the one thing your husband kept that nobody else in the family ever understood. I'd like to hear about it, and I'll read every one of them. Hit subscribe. That's all of it. Thank you for sitting with me on the porch tonight. I'll see you in the next one.